Hello and welcome to the first annual Follow Money, Fight Slavery Summit. I'm Sam Graver, Chief Communication Officer for the Anti-Human Trafficking Intelligence Initiative, also known as ATII. ATII helps financial institutions promote their corporate social responsibility through increasing awareness, facilitating intelligence integration and technology advancement, all while establishing strategic data collaboration focused on one outcome: to combat the trafficking of our fellow humans. Now, throughout this summit, you've heard why now, more than ever, it is time for financial institutions to take action against human trafficking. For human trafficking is by far the most egregious of financial crimes, and this is an industry call to action. Thus far, you've heard from a multitude of financial experts who have a passion for combating human trafficking through their work in the financial sector. You've heard from a survivor leader's perspective as well. Well, it is my distinct pleasure to add one very critical voice to that conversation, that of someone who has dedicated her career to countering all types of human trafficking. With nearly 2 decades of federal law enforcement experience behind her, Interim Director Angie Salazar brings much wisdom to the anti-trafficking table, along with her pragmatic know-how. Interim Director Salazar has had an impressive array of notable accomplishments during her career. These run the gamut from developing policies and initiatives regarding human trafficking and investigative programs, conducting global training on best practices for fighting human trafficking, and coordinating with both U.S. and international government agencies on trafficking investigation and services for victims. Interim Director Salazar is the current Interim Director of the Department of Homeland Security Center on Countering Human Trafficking. By employing innovative law enforcement programs, victim advocacy, and education, the center is at the forefront of DHS's work in countering all types of human trafficking, including sex trafficking and forced labor. Then this is what Director Salazar is here to elaborate on for our summit attendees. Director Salazar, thank you so much for being with me today. Are you ready to roll?
I am. Thank you very much for the introduction.
Absolutely. I'm so thrilled to have you here. And I know you have a presentation for us. If you would like, I will turn the Zoom controls over to you, my friend. There we go.
Perfect.
Excellent.
Perfect. As you heard, I am Angie Salazar. I am the Interim Director for the newly created DHS Center for Countering Human Trafficking. I just want to start by thanking you for being here today, for listening in on the information we have to offer. As mentioned, I've been working on human trafficking investigations for the better part of my career, and there isn't a more egregious crime happening. The Department of Homeland Security sees a wide array of crimes, from fraud, money laundering, drug trafficking, but I can tell you from working with victims, there isn't a more horrific crime than to see other human beings' pride taken away, their sometimes even their will to live. And so I just want to personally thank you for working with us to identify, to disrupt, and to work together to combat this crime. And I'll start by sharing a PowerPoint so you can follow along. So the DHS Center for Countering Human Trafficking was started last year in 2020. And in 2020, we had, it was a real big year for countering trafficking, not just for the Department of Homeland Security, but for the US government as a whole. It was the 20th anniversary of the Palermo Protocol and the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It was, a good year for us to take stock of how far we'd come and what more we could do. And in line with those milestones, DHS announced its strategy in January and the official launch of the new center in October. And so on October 20th, the DHS acting secretary signed a proclamation announcing the creation of the Center for Countering Human Trafficking. It's the first unified interdepartmental coordination center for holistically countering human trafficking and the importation of goods produced with forced labor overseas. The center's inception began several months prior. In January 2020, the acting secretary issued the DHS strategy to combat human trafficking, the importation of goods produced with forced labor, and child exploitation. And at that time, he declared his commitment to, quote, integrate DHS efforts in such a way that will culminate in a center to combat human trafficking at the department, end quote. So there was extensive research and analysis conducted to identify the agencies within the Department of Homeland Security that had a significant counter-human trafficking footprint. And as a result, the 16 agencies listed on this slide are the ones that were asked by the secretary to co-locate at our new center. So it's a total of 16 agencies, and the center integrates each of their efforts, and it establishes a mechanism to harmonize, leverage, centralize, and coordinate capabilities and resources to combat trafficking and the importation of goods produced with forced labor. So the goal is that all the folks who've come over to the center, and we already have personnel from each one of these agencies identified, and the goal is for them to come over, sit at the center with their existing authority, with their existing databases, and with their existing knowledge and expertise, and to apply that to investigations that we are supporting or to leads that we receive through any variety of mechanisms. So, for example, if an agent reaches out to us or an officer and says, I've interviewed a victim and this is some identifiable information and these are the suspects that we think may have been involved in human trafficking, all the officers, analysts, attorneys, or personnel from the agencies you see on this PowerPoint slide would come together and research their data, whether it's travel data with Customs and Border Protection, or trade data, or immigration services, or visas with CIS. All of us would research and try to come up with a full picture of everyone involved or everyone that's been touched by the victim or the trafficker in order to pursue the investigation and make sure we hold traffickers accountable and that we identify all the victims, not just the one that we've learned about through the reporting party. This is our mission, but functionally, the purpose of the center is to break down the silos between the DHS agencies and teams, to promote collaboration, and bring together the diverse expertise from across the department, and of course, share promising practices to achieve this mission. The center also brings clear accountability and more efficient use of existing resources. So this slide provides you with a visual on the center organization and the placement within DHS. And as a government employee, I recognize the idea of understanding the government can be daunting, but for the purposes of the center, this provides you with our sections. So the center is set up in two main units, the operations side and the program side. The two units consistently communicate, and we are already seeing how the two complement each other. For example, as we get requests for training in the US and foreign, we're already asking what the audience is looking to learn or understand, or how they're looking to expand their anti-trafficking efforts. And the training side will go over to operations and talk to the agents, the officers, the analysts, and say, this is what I'm looking for. What are you encountering real time that can be used in the training we're developing for specific audiences? The human trafficking section provides support to ongoing criminal investigations, both commercial sex and labor, international and domestic, and by providing subject matter expertise in the development, tracking, and coordination of leads. The forced labor in the supply chain section many of you have probably seen on the news, the withhold release orders that Customs and Border Protection Office of Trade has issued to bar products entering the U.S. supply chain that were produced with forced labor. So our forced labor operations section is also focusing in on that activity. What is the product entering? Is there any knowledge on behalf of the company? How do we stop this? How do we help protect those victims abroad? And what, if any, federal prosecutions can we pursue for those folks looking to increase their profit by exploiting people abroad? And then the intelligence section is dedicated to supporting all investigations and to helping us build out those investigations to make sure that we're pursuing, like I said earlier, all the perpetrators, all the victims, and whenever possible, if there is a method of operation or a recruitment method that we're seeing over and over, that we share that with our outreach and awareness and training to get it out real time so that we can inform communities and small towns of what this recruitment method is and increase real-time prevention so people can be on the lookout and protect the vulnerable population. So thus far, some of the progress we've made, we're already supporting 7 commercial sex human trafficking investigations. We are supporting 8 forced labor supply chain cases involving Asia, Africa, and South America. And, you know, from the first slide of the 16 agencies, we've identified the personnel. We're working on co-locating and leveraging the strengths of every single person who's come over and making sure that we respond to requests for information, that we work with industry and in forums like this where we can share what we're doing and whenever possible provide training. So our approach is to prioritize the targeting of human traffickers. We all know that at the bottom line for human traffickers is money, and they are exploiting people, isolating people, slowly but surely breaking down their ability to stand up for themselves, all with the end goal of making money. So our goal is to always address these motivating factors, right? Hold human traffickers financially accountable. This strategy aligns with our DHS victim-centered approach, since it's less reliant on victim testimony and enables a more accurate calculation of restitution that traffickers can be ordered to pay victims. So HSI has worked closely with FinCEN to update the human trafficking advisory for financial industry, and we routinely share information and intelligence to advance human trafficking investigations and enforcement action. And we've learned from the cases that we've investigated that human traffickers exploit legitimate financial institutions. Banks and other money service businesses can be used throughout the trafficking lifecycle. They can be used to store, conceal, send, or launder funds. Human traffickers are agile and adaptive in how they exploit the financial industry to advance their illicit enterprise and profit from the victims. So we must also continuously tailor our efforts and be nuanced in how we combat human trafficking in order to be effective. Some of the financial trends in human trafficking investigations. For those of you who are familiar with human trafficking, the trends listed here are probably not new to you, but are worthy of sharing because they do emphasize the validity of the red flag indicators and guidance developed by FinCEN and the financial institutions working to combat trafficking. Flow of funds in and out of MSB are highly disproportionate, significant use of wire transfers, HSI is not detecting the use of cryptocurrency, such as Bitcoin, by human traffickers. We are seeing it, though, in child pornography and child sexual exploitation. And virtual currencies do pose a risk of being exploited by human traffickers. And it's a vulnerability that, for financial industry, we should be watching closely. In my opinion, there's no better way to share how human traffickers exploit financial industry or how they operate than a case study. So I'm going to share with you a little bit about an investigation we had out of the Northern District of Texas and out of our Dallas office. Operation Dollhouse was an investigation into the business you see pictured here. It was an organization that recruited victims via Facebook. The traffickers lured them with promises of a better life. And instead, what happened was the victims were forced to work day and night at this massage parlor and other locations. The recruiter and enforcer, owner of the Dollhouse, and the manager arranged illicit meetups on Backpage.com that were thinly disguised as body rub treatments. The human traffickers confiscated all of the victims' proceeds, and they used violence and threats to keep victims from leaving. If the victims failed to earn their daily quota, which ranged between $1,000 and $1,500 per day, they were physically abused. The owners, operators, original of the Dollhouse, took their operation a step further and partnered with local pimps who had minors, and started allowing these pimps to use the Dollhouse for some of the commercial sexual activity. One of, some of the violence that the victims shared was if they weren't allowed to go to sleep until they'd met their daily quota, and one time, one of the victims fell asleep before meeting the quota and without the permission of the traffickers, and she was beat so badly they took her head to the toilet and broke the toilet seat with her head. The Dollhouse massage parlor was a shell company. They laundered their proceeds through purchase of cars and real property. They had Maseratis, multiple real estate, and then they would also go to the casino and play at the casinos, hoping to win and clean some of their money. Excuse me. They used postal money orders in structuring schemes, so they would avoid the thresholds by wiring money via money orders. Each of the associated massage parlors had ATMs inside, and they would ask the customers, the Johns, to use the ATM to withdraw cash for paying to try and maintain that cash business. And then we were able to track large deposits into the defendant's account. Some of the law enforcement used, multiple investigation methods. They did electronic surveillance, undercover operations, in addition, many financial investigative tools. So they were able to find many reports that the financial industry provided. They didn't, and I'll share, because I imagine many of the listeners are anti-money laundering. Many of the reports didn't rise to the level of human trafficking, but we wouldn't expect financial industry to be able to describe the force, fraud, or coercion. However, once the agents and investigators started pursuing these cases, they worked with the authors of those reports. So they continued to receive detailed and timely information from financial industry, and that information provided critical evidence for the success of this case. The reporting from financial institutions truly, and I talked to the case agent before this, and I'll quote him, he said it made the good case into a great case. It allowed him to further the financial footprint of this trafficking organization into safety deposit box, additional bank accounts, ultimately, he was able to track $2.1 million laundered in a 6-month period. And I'll share that the victims charged about $100 per commercial sex act. So you can just tally up the amount of commercial sex, the amount of times these victims were raped in a very short amount of time. So the impact, 19 defendants were convicted, 41 victims were identified and assisted, and we were able to seize over $1 million. And the two there pictured are the owners, enforcers of the massage parlor. The second case I want to talk to you about is the Rendon Reyes Human Trafficking Organization out of our New York office. So I'll tell you about this because, in fact, we're currently working on a threat assessment as part of the White House's National Action Plan. And one of the threats that we are naming is Tlaxcala, Mexico-based human trafficking organizations. And this is one of them. So what we find is that there is countless human trafficking organizations coming out of this area in Mexico, and they all use the same exact method. They romantically lure impoverished, uneducated females from around the country that they see in financial need, and they'll lure them by starting as by portraying the relationship initially as romantically involved, where they pursue them as a girlfriend. Sometimes they marry them, sometimes they have children with them. If the victims' families are poor, they will, provide financial assistance to the family in the form of food or paying for some of their expenses. But ultimately, they turn on the victims and force the victims into commercial sex. And they'll force them by holding their children against them, by beating them, by shaming them, by taking pictures and threatening to share that information publicly. And that it's standard across the board. We've had many cases with traffickers from this area in Mexico, and they all use the same exact method. So this group, the Rendon Reyes, smuggled numerous young women and girls from Mexico and Central America into the US, and they forced them to engage in commercial sex. Most of the victims in these cases are completely subdued and under the control of the traffickers before they're brought into the United States. They don't want to run the risk of the victims speaking out to law enforcement during their travel or illegal entry into the United States. In this case, it was a multi-agency investigation. Many of the members you see pictured here were arrested in Mexico and subsequently extradited to the United States. These traffickers pictured here forced victims to use wire transfers to send money they earned to the organization's leadership in Mexico. The victims often used aliases or other victims' ID to send money. It was difficult to determine who actually sent the money, but the financial picture arose because the recipients were, accurate, or the phone number was accurate. There's always one identifiable information on the recipient end that you can count on that it will be the actual person, because they don't want to lose the money or have it not show up at a wire remitter company in Mexico and have no way to track it if they use all fake information. Members of the trafficking organization in Mexico would receive the money. The money is then invested in living expenses, real property, cars, living expenses, things like that. The traffickers, as I mentioned, and sometimes in the US, there's taxi drivers who will drive the victims to visit John's, and it's almost a delivery commercial sex business. So in this case, all of the defendants pled guilty to sex trafficking and related charges. 8 defendants were sentenced to prison terms ranging from 8 to 25 years, and 16 victims were identified and assisted. So our call to action for financial institutions is we're asking that you use the human trafficking checkbox when reporting suspicious activity. This enables us as law enforcement to quickly and more accurately query information that may help advance human trafficking cases. We ask that you record as much detail as possible. Information you may think is not pertinent, as a result, you exclude it, but it might actually further our investigation. We ask that you record behavioral, transactional, and demographic details. The presence of a single financial indicator cannot always signify human trafficking, so we're always looking for a combination of indicators, and we'll build the case out. We ask that you record as much identifying information as possible, emails, social media. We worked on a lot of cases in South Texas, and oftentimes when opening accounts, they'd always list their occupation. That became really helpful when establishing a pattern, especially when going to trial. Most of these traffickers face minimum mandatory sentences, and so you can always, almost always be sure you will be going to trial on these cases. And then in reporting to law enforcement, we say, provide expert insight. As experts in the financial industry with experience in typical financial behavior, we ask that you inform law enforcement when atypical financial behavior occurs, and your assessment of why such behavior could indicate a crime or, what caused you to be suspicious. When building these cases, a lot of the time, banking information is what we use to fill the intelligence gaps and to develop human trafficking leads. So thank you in advance for writing these reports, but I really think it's important to let you know that it truly is useful and it fills the gap, and sometimes it can even help us from avoiding the need to put a victim on the stand. And as we continue the work at the center, we're going to continue to work on identifying better financial indicators on labor trafficking and the importation of goods produced with forced labor, and share those as soon as we have them. Additionally, we want to bolster relationships between financial intelligence and reporting to law enforcement. We think enhancing communication and familiarity with people and processes will help us facilitate this. We want to standardize training on human trafficking. We're going to continue to expand capacity to correctly identify human trafficking and really avoid conflation with commercial sex and human smuggling. We find that, and many of you who are familiar with human trafficking, the general public believes that human trafficking requires movement, and so it's often confused with human smuggling. You'll see it in the media, you'll see it in paper, or all kinds of people consistently make the mistake of calling human smuggling, right? People crossing the border illegally, calling it trafficking. It's not. Human trafficking requires that someone be held against their will for force, by force, fraud, or coercion for 2 things: for forced labor or for a commercial sex act. So continuing the training on that and clarifying it, we believe will help us with identifying financial footprints. And if possible, improve visibility on source of funds with wire records of cross-border transaction, especially involving smaller international money remitters. We find that with international cases, wire transfers are often the method preferred to send proceeds back to home countries. This is our information. You can reach us via the top email, but the resources that existed will stay. The ICE tip line for reporting suspicious activity will continue to receive the leads. The National Human Trafficking Hotline, we're going to continue to work with them. And the DHS Blue campaign that now sits within the Center of Countering Human Trafficking will continue to produce their educational material and will continue to have their website.
Wow. All right, that was very informative, Director. I thought, my goodness, I was going to ask you some questions, but I think you covered it all. But I do want to thank you for your time and putting that together. Very thorough. That was very helpful. I'll be pulling a little bit of information out to kind of highlight as I send that out to our audience. Is there anything you want to add to a very thorough presentation?
No, I just want to say thank you again, and we cannot fight this alone, right? As yes. Someone who's worked with victims, and when you're out there trying to make someone whole, you become keenly aware that it takes a community effort to truly combat the crime, protect the victims, and hold perpetrators accountable.
Yes, yes. And you hit on so many important issues like the silos, not only within law enforcement, but we see that in the NGO space, which is, for those of you who don't know that term, that's the non-governmental organizations. We see that a lot. And there's a lot of this close to the vest, protecting our methodology and protocols. But I often say, leave your ego at the door because it doesn't belong in this room or on this phone call. We're here to protect our fellow human beings. It's not, there is no mine or yours. It's ours. It's humanity working together. Thank you for highlighting, especially the very, very end. That's what I'm going to point out to folks, is how they can make things produce more evidence for you. And I've heard from many of the investigators that it is their goal to not have to re-traumatize the victim. So the stronger their case can be on the financial side, the better. So yeah, more information, but actionable information. Thank you for sharing that. That's really helpful.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. All right. Bye, everybody. Thank you so much for listening.